The plane lurched through the stormy Chicago sky, its wings slicing through thick gray clouds as it climbed toward Seattle. Inside the economy-class cabin of Flight 247, the air was thick with tension, the hum of the engines barely audible over the nervous chatter of passengers. Overhead bins rattled and the dim cabin lights flickered as turbulence shook the aircraft, sending a plastic cup rolling down the aisle. Sarah Bennett sat in seat 17C, her plain navy sweater blending into the worn fabric of the seat, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers still, as if the chaos around her was nothing more than a passing breeze. Most passengers gripped their armrests, their knuckles white, their breaths short and jagged. But Sarah's chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her eyes, half closed, focused on something no one else could see. A little boy. Tommy, maybe 7 years old, sat beside her, clutching a worn-out toy truck, his wide eyes darting to the window where lightning flashed in the distance. His mother, Lisa, a tired-looking woman with a messy bun and a faded denim jacket, kept whispering to him, her voice trembling. "It's okay, baby. Just a little bumpy." Sarah glanced at Tommy, offering a small nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile, like a silent promise that everything would be fine. Tommy stared back, his grip on the truck loosening slightly, his small chest mimicking her steady breathing. Across the aisle, a man in a crisp suit, Robert Klein, loosened his silk tie, his Rolex glinting under the cabin lights. His sharp features were twisted in irritation as he leaned toward the woman next to him, a middle-aged influencer named Margaret, whose designer earrings sparkled even in the dim light. "Look at her," Robert muttered loud enough for nearby seats to hear, nodding toward Sarah. "Sitting there like she's on a Sunday drive. Probably some nobody who thinks she's above all this." Margaret, her lips pursed, adjusted her cashmere scarf and whispered back, "No kidding. She's not even blinking. What's wrong with her? Doesn't she get how serious this is?" Their words carried sharp and smug, drawing nervous glances from other passengers. A young guy in a hoodie, Jake, his earbuds dangling, nudged his friend Ethan, who was scrolling on his phone. "Check her out," Jake said, his voice low but pointed. "Acting like this is just another Tuesday. Who does that?" Ethan shrugged, barely looking up. "Maybe she's clueless, man." The plane jolted again, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Trays rattled, and a woman in a bright red coat clutched her rosary, murmuring prayers under her breath. Sarah's eyes flicked open for a moment, scanning the cabin, then closed again, her face unreadable. A man in a tailored blazer, his hair slicked back, and a gold chain peeking from his collar, stood up, his hands shaking despite his confident posture. "You," he said, pointing at Sarah, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "You're just sitting there like this is a game. What you think you're tougher than the rest of us?" His name was Victor, a real estate broker who thrived on being heard. But his bravado faltered under Sarah's brief, piercing glance. She tilted her head slightly, her voice low and calm. "Sit down," she said, the words soft, but carrying a weight that made Victor freeze. He sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath, but the tension in the cabin only grew thicker. Lisa, Tommy's mother, leaned over her hand, trembling as she touched Sarah's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "He's been scared stiff. But you're calming him down." Sarah gave a small nod, her eyes softening for a moment before returning to their steady focus. She adjusted her worn canvas tote under the seat, her movements precise, almost mechanical, like she was arranging tools rather than a bag of personal items. The plane steadied for a moment, and the cabin's tension eased, but the whispers didn't stop. Jake, the guy in the hoodie, leaned toward Ethan again. "She's freaking me out, man. Nobody's that calm. Bet she's on something. Ethan snorted, still glued to his phone. Or maybe she's just got no clue what's going on. A woman in a business suit, her glasses fogging with nervous sweat, turned to her seatmate, a man in a loud Hawaiian shirt. "Some people just don't know their place," she said, her voice dripping with disdain as she glanced at Sarah. "Sitting there like she owns the plane." The man chuckled, his tie clashing with his shirt. "Bet she's never even been on a flight like this before." Their words sparked murmurs from others, a ripple of judgment spreading through the cabin. Sarah's hand rested on her tote's zipper, her fingers brushing it lightly, but her face stayed calm. She turned slightly, her eyes locking on the woman in the business suit for a moment. "You'd be surprised," she said, her voice quiet, but sharp enough to make the woman look away, fussing with her papers. The intercom crackled, and the pilot's voice came through, calm but strained. "Folks, just some turbulence. We're leveling out now. Everything's under control." The cabin exhaled, some passengers clapping weakly, desperate to believe the words. Tommy let out a shaky breath, his toy truck hugged tighter to his chest. Sarah leaned down, her voice low. "You're doing great, kid," she said, and Tommy's eyes lit up like her words were a lifeline. A few rows back, an older man in a faded leather jacket. Harold watched Sarah, his brow furrowing like he was trying to place her face. He leaned toward his wife Ellen and whispered something, but she shook her head, dismissing him. "You're imagining things," she muttered, her hands clutching a knitting magazine. Harold didn't respond, his fingers tapping his tray table, his eyes fixed on Sarah. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, and the cabin erupted in gasps again. A woman with overdone makeup and a designer handbag leaned forward, her voice sharp. "She's not even fazed," she said loud enough for Sarah to hear. "What kind of person just sits there like that?" Her friend, a man with a flashy watch, nodded. "Probably thinks she's better than us. Look at that sweater, Bet. It's from a thrift store." Their words stung, and a few passengers nodded, their fear turning to resentment. Sarah's eyes flicked toward them, but she didn't respond. Her fingers paused on her tote's strap, her gaze steady like she was measuring the room. The woman in the red coat, still clutching her rosary, whispered to her neighbor, "She's going to jinx us." "That attitude's dangerous." The neighbor, a college student with a backpack stuffed under his seat, nodded nervously. "Yeah, she's too calm. It's weird." Lisa, Tommy's mother, watched Sarah closely, her hands tightening on her son's shoulder. "You're not scared at all, are you?" she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and confusion. Sarah didn't answer directly, just gave another small nod, her eyes scanning the cabin again. Under her sleeve, her fingers brushed her smartwatch, tapping a subtle sequence so quick it looked like she was adjusting her cuff. In a control room at O'Hare Airport, a blinking dot appeared on a screen, and a special ops officer leaned forward, his voice tight. "Agent Bennett's in position," he said, his team scrambling to pull up flight data and radio channels. Back on the plane, Sarah's gaze settled on the cockpit door, her breathing unchanged, her hands still. The cabin's hostility grew a low hum of resentment, but she didn't flinch. Tommy reached out his small hand, brushing her sleeve like he was anchoring himself to the only calm thing in the room. A man in his 50s. His suit wrinkled, and his face etched with worry, clutched a photo of his family, his voice breaking as he glared at Sarah. "You're not even trying to help," he said, his words trembling. "What kind of person just sits there?" His name was David, a father of 2, and his fear for his family back home made his voice raw. The cabin's anger toward Sarah flared, passengers nodding in agreement, their fear twisting into blame. Sarah's eyes softened for a moment, catching the photo in his hand. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but kind. "Your family's waiting for you." "Stay calm," she said. David blinked, his grip on the photo tightening, and he sat back, his anger faltering, though he still looked confused. The plane lurched again, and the cabin's tension spiked, the overhead bins creaking ominously. A teenage girl with dyed purple hair, her phone clutched tightly, whispered to her mother, "She's going to get us in trouble. Why's she so calm?" Her mother, a woman with a tired face and a cheap scarf, nodded. "She's not normal. Something's off." The storm outside raged on, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, stark flashes. Sarah's tote sat under her seat, a small, folded photo tucked inside a younger Sarah, maybe 20, standing next to a man in a military uniform, both smiling, his arm around her shoulder. She didn't look at the photo now, but her fingers brushed the tote's zipper, a quick, unconscious motion. Lisa noticed her eyes softening, like she recognized something in that gesture. "You've been through something like this before, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah didn't answer, just gave a small nod, her eyes still scanning the cabin. The plane's engines roared as it fought through the storm, and the passengers' fear hung heavy, their whispers growing sharper, their eyes fixed on Sarah, the woman who refused to panic. Robert, the businessman, leaned forward again, his voice low but venomous. "You're freaking everyone out," he said, his Rolex glinting as he pointed at her. "What's your deal?" Sarah's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I'm just waiting," she said, her voice quiet but firm, like a door clicking shut. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it, sinking back into his seat, his smirk gone. The cabin's murmurs grew louder, a mix of fear and frustration, all directed at the woman in the navy sweater who sat too still, too calm, too unshaken. Tommy's small hand stayed near hers, his toy truck resting on his lap, now his breathing slower, steadier. Lisa watched Sarah, her fear giving way to a flicker of trust. Harold, the older man in the faded jacket, kept staring, his fingers still tapping, like he was piecing together a puzzle no one else could see. The plane flew on the storm raging outside, and Sarah Bennett sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes sharp, waiting for the moment she knew was coming. The storm outside Flight 247 from Chicago to Seattle raged on the plane, shuddering as it sliced through turbulent skies. Inside the economy-class cabin, the air was heavy with fear, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the faces of passengers. The hum of the engines was drowned out by nervous whispers and the occasional sob as the turbulence refused to relent. Sarah Bennett sat in seat 17C, her navy sweater unremarkable, her posture calm, almost meditative. Her hands rested on her canvas tote, fingers still, her breathing steady despite the plane's jolts. Tommy, the 7-year-old beside her, clutched his toy truck, his eyes wide but less frantic now, mirroring Sarah's quiet composure. His mother, Lisa, kept a protective hand on his shoulder, her face pale but softened by the reassurance Sarah's presence seemed to offer. The cabin's tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with every lurch, and Sarah remained its focal point, her calmness drawing both curiosity and resentment. Across the aisle, Robert Klein, the businessman with the Rolex, muttered to Margaret, the influencer in the cashmere scarf. "She's still just sitting there," he hissed, his voice sharp with irritation. "What's her problem? Does she not care we're all freaking out?" Margaret nodded, her earrings glinting as she leaned closer. "It's unnatural. She's acting like she's better than us, like we're beneath her." Their words carried sparking murmurs from nearby seats. Jake, the young guy in the hoodie, nudged Ethan, his friend who was still glued to his phone. "I'm telling you, man, she's too calm. Bet she's got something to do with this turbulence or whatever's going on." Jake whispered, his voice tinged with suspicion. Ethan shrugged, barely looking up. Maybe she's just high or something. Who cares? The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, and a collective gasp filled the cabin trays, rattling overhead bins creaking. Sarah's eyes flicked open briefly, scanning the aisle, then closed again, her face unreadable, her hands unmoving. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed open, and 3 men in dark masks stormed in their boots, heavy on the carpet. Guns gleamed in their hands, compact pistols, lethal and precise. The leader, a wiry man with a faint scar across his jaw, grabbed a flight attendant named Emily by the arm, yanking her toward the front. Her name tag glinted under the cabin lights, her face drained of color as she stumbled, a small gasp escaping her lips. The leader pressed a gun to her temple and shouted into a handheld radio, his voice rough and commanding. "Ground control! Listen up. $30 million a fueled plane and a clear runway. You've got 1 hour or she's dead." The cabin erupted in screams, passengers ducking, some sliding to the floor, others clutching each other. Emily's eyes darted around, pleading silently, but she held still, her hands trembling. Sarah didn't move. Her hands stayed folded, her breathing, even her eyes, fixed on the leader's grip on the gun. The cabin's panic surged, but Sarah's calm stood out like a beacon, drawing more glares than ever. Jake, now crouched in his seat, pointed at Sarah, his voice shaking. "Look at her. She's not even scared. She's gotta be with them." Heads turned, eyes narrowing. "Margaret." Her voice dripping with disdain hissed, "Why is she just sitting there? She's not normal." Robert leaned forward, his face red with frustration. "What are you, some kind of plant? You're freaking everyone out." Sarah's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I'm not with them," she said, her voice quiet, but firm like a lock clicking into place. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it, sinking back into his seat, his confidence shaken. A man in his 50s, David, the one clutching a photo of his family, glared at Sarah, his voice breaking. "You're not doing anything. My kids are waiting for me, and you're just sitting there like this is nothing." His words trembled raw with fear, and the cabin's anger toward Sarah flared hotter, passengers nodding, their fear twisting into blame. Sarah's eyes softened, catching the photo in his hand, a smiling wife and 2 young girls. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but kind. "They'll see you soon. Stay calm." David blinked, his grip on the photo tightening, and he sat back, his anger faltering, though confusion lingered in his eyes. Sarah's mind drifted unbidden to a memory from years ago. She was 24, sitting in a dusty FBI training facility in Virginia, her instructor's voice echoing through the room. "Control the room. Not the fight," he'd said, his hands demonstrating a disarm move she'd practiced until her muscles ached. She'd been the youngest in her unit, a rising star in counterterrorism, her focus unshakable even then. But a mission gone wrong, her partner's blood on her hands, a bomb she couldn't stop, had haunted her, pushing her to retire early, to fade into a quiet life. Now, on this plane, that training hummed beneath her skin, her eyes tracking the leader's movements, the way he shifted his weight, the slight tremor in his gun hand, the way his 2 accomplices glanced at him for cues. They were disciplined but not flawless, their coordination loose, their eyes darting too often. Sarah's fingers brushed her smartwatch, tapping a subtle code, her movements so slight they went unnoticed. In a Chicago control room, a special ops commander saw a blinking dot on his screen. "Agent Bennett's active," he said, his voice tight, his team pulling up satellite feeds and radio channels. Back in the cabin, Lisa, Tommy's mother, watched Sarah closely, her hands shaking as she held her son. "How do you know they'll be okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the passengers' muffled sobs. Sarah didn't answer directly, just leaned closer, her voice low. "They need her alive for now," she said, nodding toward Emily. "They won't shoot yet." Lisa's eyes widened, her fear mingling with a flicker of trust. Tommy reached out his small hand, brushing Sarah's sleeve, his toy truck resting on his lap. "Are you a superhero?" he whispered, his voice trembling but hopeful. Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Just someone who's been here before," she said, her eyes never leaving the leader. A few rows back, Harold, the older man in the faded leather jacket, stared at Sarah, his brow furrowed. He leaned toward his wife Ellen and whispered, "I know her face. I read about her, a hostage crisis in Denver years ago. She was the one who saved those people." Ellen shook her head. Her knitting magazine crumpled in her hands. "You're seeing things, Harold. She's just some woman." But Harold's fingers kept tapping his tray table, his eyes fixed on Sarah like he was piecing together a puzzle. The leader's radio crackled and he shouted again, his voice sharper. "No tricks, ground control. Money plane. Runway now." Emily flinched, a tear rolling down her cheek, but she stayed silent, her hands clenched. The cabin was a chorus of sobs, now passengers burying their faces, some praying, others rocking back and forth. The woman in the red coat, still clutching her rosary, whispered to her neighbor, "She's going to get us killed." "That woman's too calm." The college student beside her nodded, his backpacks stuffed under his seat. "It's like she's taunting them." Jake, the guy in the hoodie, overheard and snapped, "Stop acting like you're above this. You're making it worse." Sarah didn't look at him, her eyes locked on the leader, watching the way his fingers tightened on the gun, the way his accomplices shifted their weight, one guarding the cockpit door, the other pacing the rear. Her hands stayed still, but her mind was racing, calculating distances, angles, weaknesses. A woman in a business suit, her glasses fogging with tears, turned to Sarah, her voice trembling with fury. "Why are you so calm? Don't you care about any of us?" Her words broke, and she covered her mouth, sobbing. The accusation hit like a slap, and a few passengers murmured in agreement, their anger growing. Sarah's hand rested on her tote, her fingers steady. She leaned toward the woman, her voice soft but firm. "I care," she said, her eyes meeting hers for a moment, a quiet promise. The woman blinked, caught off guard, and looked away, adjusting her glasses with shaking hands. One of the terrorists, a stocky man with a shaved head, stopped near Sarah's row, his gun swinging lazily. "What's with you?" he growled, his eyes narrowing. "You got a death wish or something?" Sarah met his gaze, her face calm, her eyes like steel. "You're wasting time," she said, her voice low, deliberate. The henchman blinked, thrown off, then turned away, muttering to himself, his bravado shaken. The plane lurched again, and the cabin's fear spiked, the overhead bins rattling louder. Margaret, the influencer, leaned toward Robert, her voice low but vicious. "She's going to get us shot. Who does she think she is?" Robert nodded, his face slick with sweat. "She's jinxing us. That attitude's going to get that poor woman killed." Their words sparked more whispers, the cabin's hostility toward Sarah growing thicker, a low hum of resentment. Sarah's eyes flicked to them, but she didn't respond, her gaze returning to the leader. Tommy's mother, Lisa, watched closely, her hand tightening on her son's shoulder, like she was starting to believe Sarah knew something they didn't. The leader paced the aisle, his gun still pressed to Emily's temple, his radio crackling with static. 45 minutes, he shouted, his voice raw with impatience. Emily's knees buckled, but he yanked her upright, the gun pressing harder. Passengers wailed, some covering their eyes, others frozen in terror. Sarah's tote sat under her seat, the folded photo inside a younger Sarah standing beside her mentor in the FBI, his arm around her, both of them smiling after her first successful mission. She didn't look at it now, but her fingers brushed the tote's zipper, a quick, unconscious motion. Lisa noticed her eyes softening further. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Sarah gave a small nod, her eyes still on the leader, watching his every move, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his men glanced at him, waiting for orders. The cabin's fear was palpable, but Sarah's calm was a counterpoint, a steady thread in the chaos. "Harold." The older man leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "I'm telling you, Ellen, she's no ordinary passenger," he said, his eyes never leaving Sarah. Ellen sighed, dismissing him, but Harold's certainty grew. His fingers still tapping, like he was waiting for Sarah to prove him right. The plane flew on the storm outside, unrelenting, the terrorists' demands hanging heavy over the cabin. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded, her breathing steady, her eyes sharp. The passengers' whispers grew quieter, their fear and resentment mingling, all directed at the woman who refused to break. But Sarah wasn't just waiting. She was watching, planning her past, whispering in her ear, her training alive in her bones, ready for the moment she knew was coming. The cabin of Flight 247 from Chicago to Seattle was a pressure cooker of fear, the air thick with the stench of sweat and panic. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing through the windows, casting stark shadows across the passengers' faces. The three masked terrorists held their ground, their pistols gleaming under the flickering cabin lights. The leader, his scar jagged across his jaw, kept his gun pressed to the temple of Emily. The flight attendant, whose pale face glistened with tears, she fought to hold back. His radio crackled with static, his voice a low growl as he barked into it. "Ground control. You've got 10 minutes. 30 million, a plane, and a clear runway, or she's done." The cabin erupted in fresh sobs, passengers huddling together, some whispering prayers, others burying their faces in their hands. Sarah Bennett sat in seat 17C, her navy sweater blending into the economy-class seat, her hands folded calmly on her lap. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, tracked the leader's every move, the slight tremor in his gun hand, the way his accomplices shifted nervously, their coordination fraying at the edges. Tommy, the 7-year-old beside her, clung to his toy truck, his small body pressed close to his mother, Lisa, who watched Sarah with a mix of awe and desperation. The cabin's hostility towards Sarah had reached a fever pitch, her unshakable calm, a lightning rod for their fear and resentment. Across the aisle, Robert Klein, the businessman with the Rolex, leaned toward Margaret, the influencer, his voice dripping with venom. "She's going to get us all killed," he hissed. His tie loosened, his face slick with sweat. "Sitting there like she's on vacation. Who does she think she is?" Margaret nodded, her cashmere scarf slipping slightly as she whispered back. "It's like she's mocking us. She's not even human." Their words sparked murmurs from nearby seats. A ripple of agreement spreading through the cabin. Jake, the young guy in the hoodie, now crouched low, pointed at Sarah, his voice trembling. "She's too calm. She's gotta be working with them." His friend Ethan, still clutching his phone, muttered, "Or she's just crazy. Nobody's that chill." The woman in the red coat, her rosary beads clicking furiously, leaned toward her neighbor, a college student with a backpack. "She's dangerous," she whispered. "That attitude's going to get that poor girl shot." The student nodded, his eyes darting to Sarah, his hands gripping his armrests. Sarah's gaze remained fixed on the leader, her breathing steady, her hands still. Under her sleeve, her fingers brushed her smartwatch, tapping a final sequence so subtle it looked like a nervous tick. In a Chicago control room, a special ops commander stared at a blinking dot on his screen. His voice tight. "Bennett's signaling she's about to move," he said, his team scrambling to coordinate with ground forces in Seattle. Back on the plane, Lisa, Tommy's mother, leaned closer to Sarah, her voice a shaky whisper. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" Sarah gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving the leader. Tommy, his toy truck pressed to his chest, looked up at her, his voice barely audible. "Are you gonna save her?" Sarah's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Just keep breathing, kid," she said, her voice low but firm, like a promise. The cabin's tension was suffocating, the passengers' glares boring into Sarah, their fear twisting into accusations. The leader's radio crackled again and his patience snapped. 10 minutes, he roared, shoving Emily forward. She stumbled, catching herself on a seat, her hands shaking, a small sob escaping her lips. The cabin wailed, passengers ducking lower, some covering their eyes. The stocky terrorist with the shaved head paced the rear, his gun swinging, his eyes darting nervously. The other, a lanky man with a twitchy demeanor, guarded the cockpit door, his grip on his pistol too tight, betraying his inexperience. Sarah's eyes flicked between them, noting their positions, their weaknesses. She'd seen this before, years ago, in a Denver warehouse, a hostage crisis that had ended with her disarming 4 gunmen in under a minute. The memory was sharp, her muscles tensing with the same instincts, her mind calculating angles and timing. The passengers didn't see it, but Sarah was a coiled spring ready to snap. Harold, the older man in the faded leather jacket, watched Sarah closely, his brow furrowed. He leaned toward his wife Ellen and whispered, "I'm telling you, she's the one from that Denver case. I saw her picture in the paper." Ellen rolled her eyes, clutching her knitting magazine. "You're obsessed, Harold. She's nobody." But Harold's fingers tapped faster, his certainty growing. David, the man with the family photo, clutched it tighter, his voice breaking as he glared at Sarah. "Do something," he pleaded, his face etched with desperation. "My girls need me." Sarah's eyes softened for a moment, catching the photo, 2 young girls in pigtails smiling at a park. "They'll see you soon," she said, her voice steady but kind. David blinked, his anger faltering, though his hands still trembled. The leader's radio stayed silent, and his frustration boiled over. 5 minutes, he screamed, his gun pressing harder against Emily's temple. She flinched, her knees buckling, but he yanked her upright, his scar twisting as he snarled. The cabin's sobs grew louder, passengers rocking back and forth, some whispering prayers. Jake, his face pale, pointed at Sarah again, his voice venomous. "You're making them mad! Just stop it!" Margaret chimed in, her voice sharp. "She's jinxing us! That poor woman's going to die because of her." The accusations hit like bullets, but Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on the leader, watching the way his shoulders tensed, the way his men glanced at him, waiting for orders. She leaned toward Lisa, her voice barely a whisper. "They're distracted. Stay low." Lisa's eyes widened, her hand tightening on Tommy's shoulder, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. Sarah stood the motion, smooth and deliberate, like the air itself shifted around her. Every head turned, the cabin falling silent except for the hum of the engines and the storm outside. The leader spun toward her, his gun swinging from Emily's temple to point at Sarah. "Sit down," he snapped, his voice cracking with rage. Sarah's eyes locked on his, her face calm, her voice steady. "You're making a mistake," she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade. You're losing control." The leader froze his gun, wavering his eyes, searching her face. The stocky henchman at the rear took a step forward, his gun raised. "What's your problem, lady?" he growled. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her voice low but piercing. "You're not as coordinated as you think. Your man at the cockpit's nervous. He's holding that gun too tight." "And you," she said, nodding to the leader, "you're shouting because you know ground control's stalling." The leader's jaw tightened, his scar twitching, but he didn't respond, thrown off by her calm certainty. The passengers gasped, their fear turning to shock. Jake stammered, "She's crazy. She's going to get us shot." Margaret hissed, "Shut up, you idiot." But Sarah didn't blink her eyes, still on the leader. She took a slow step forward, her hands open, non-threatening, but her posture radiated control. "Let her go," she said, nodding toward Emily. "You don't need her to make your point." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you're in charge here," he spat, but his gun wavered slightly, his confidence shaken. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of certainty. "You're running out of time," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. The lanky henchman at the cockpit door shifted his gun, twitching, and Sarah saw her opening. In a flash, she moved, closing the distance to the leader in 2 steps. Her hand snapped up, twisting his wrist with surgical precision, the gun clattering to the floor. Her elbow cracked against his jaw, and he crumpled unconscious before he hit the carpet. The cabin froze, every breath held. The stocky henchman lunged, his gun raised, but Sarah sidestepped her knee, driving into his stomach, sending him gasping to the ground. The lanky one at the cockpit door fumbled, his inexperience betraying him. Sarah spun her foot, hooking his ankle, pulling him off balance. A sharp jab to his throat dropped him, his gun skidding across the aisle. In seconds, all 3 were down, their weapons scattered, the cabin silent, except for Emily's shaky breaths as she sank to her knees free. The passengers stared, mouths open, hands trembling. Jake stammered, "What? Who are you?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked so ordinary. Robert's face was pale, his Rolex hidden under his sleeve, his bravado gone. "Harold?" The older man nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through. "Told you, Ellen," he muttered. Ellen just stared, her magazine forgotten. Sarah didn't pause, her movements precise as she pulled zip ties from her tote, securing the terrorist's hands. She knelt beside Emily, her voice soft. "You okay?" Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Sarah gave a small nod, her face calm, like she'd just finished a routine task. But Sarah's eyes caught something, a small black device tucked into the leader's jacket, its red light blinking faintly. Her training kicked in, her pulse steady as she carefully lifted it, recognizing it as a crude explosive, likely a failsafe. She slipped it into her tote, her hands steady, and moved to the cockpit door, knocking in a specific pattern. The co-pilot opened it, his face pale but relieved as he recognized her signal from earlier. "Agent Bennett," he said, his voice low. "Ground's ready for you." Sarah nodded, her voice calm. "Tell them to prep for a bomb disposal team on landing." She returned to her seat, her tote tucked under her arm, as the passengers watched in stunned silence. Lisa, clutching Tommy, whispered, "You saved her. You saved us." Tommy looked up, his eyes wide. "You are a superhero," he said, his voice full of awe. Sarah's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Just doing my job, kid," she said, her eyes flicking to the window where the storm was finally easing. The cabin's hostility had vanished, replaced by a mix of awe and shame. Jake looked away. his face red, his earlier accusations burning in his throat. Margaret fiddled with her scarf, avoiding Sarah's row entirely. David, the man with the family photo, stared at Sarah, his hands still clutching the picture, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. The plane's engines hummed softer now, the descent beginning, and Sarah sat back. Her hands folded, her face as calm as when the flight began, ready for whatever came next. The storm had finally broken as Flight 247 from Chicago descended toward Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the cabin bathed in the soft glow of runway lights cutting through the dissipating clouds. The engines hummed steadily, a stark contrast to the chaos that had gripped the plane just moments ago. The three terrorists lay bound on the floor, their wrists secured with zip ties Sarah Bennett had pulled from her canvas tote. Emily, the flight attendant, sat in a nearby seat, her hands still trembling, but her breathing steadier, her name tag slightly askew as she wiped tears from her cheeks. The passengers, once a chorus of panic and accusation, now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the subdued terrorists and Sarah, who had returned to seat 17C. Her navy sweater was slightly rumpled, but her posture remained calm. Her hands folded, her face as unreadable as it had been when the flight began. Tommy, the 7-year-old beside her, clutched his toy truck, his wide eyes fixed on Sarah with a mix of awe and gratitude. His mother, Lisa, kept a protective arm around him, her face soft with relief, but heavy with the weight of her earlier doubts. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted, the hostility toward Sarah replaced by a quiet, uneasy reverence, as if the passengers were only now seeing her for who she truly was. The intercom crackled, and the pilot's voice came through steady but tinged with gratitude. "Folks, we're beginning our final descent into Seattle. Thanks to an extraordinary passenger, we're all safe. Please remain seated." The cabin erupted in weak applause, some passengers clapping hesitantly, others still processing the whirlwind of events. Robert Klein, the businessman with the Rolex, sat slumped in his seat. His tie loosened, his face pale. He avoided Sarah's row, his earlier bravado buried under the weight of his misjudgment. Margaret, the influencer in the cashmere scarf, fidgeted with her earrings. Her lips pursed, her earlier venom replaced by a quiet shame. Jake, the young guy in the hoodie, stared at the floor, his earbuds dangling, his face flushed with embarrassment for accusing Sarah of being involved. "Ethan," his friend nudged him, muttering, "Told you she wasn't with them, man." Jake didn't respond, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his earlier accusations burning in his throat. As the plane touched down with a gentle thud, the cabin door opened and armed special forces poured in their boots, loud against the carpet. Their rifles were raised, but they froze, taking in the sight of the terrorists, already subdued, bound, and disarmed. A tall commander with a gray buzz cut stepped forward, his eyes locking on Sarah. "Agent Bennett," he said, saluting sharply. "Outstanding work, as always." The passengers gasped, some clapping louder now, others whispering in awe. Sarah gave a small nod, her face calm, her tote tucked under her arm. She stood, adjusting her sweater, and moved toward the aisle. Her steps steady, as if she hadn't just taken down 3 armed men single-handedly. The commander leaned closer, his voice low. "You didn't have to step in, Sarah. We had a team ready on the ground." Sarah shrugged, her eyes scanning the tarmac visible through the window. "They didn't have time," she said simply, her voice quiet but firm, and she stepped past him toward the exit. Lisa, clutching Tommy, stood and approached Sarah, her eyes glistening. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought you were just... Thank you." Tommy, his toy truck still in hand, looked up at Sarah, his voice small but earnest. You're a superhero, aren't you? Sarah's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. She reached into her tote, pulling out a small, worn FBI badge, its edges faded from years of use. She handed it to Tommy, her voice soft. Keep this, kid. Be brave, okay? Tommy's eyes lit up his small fingers, closing around the badge like it was a treasure. Lisa mouthed a silent thank you, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Tommy closer. The other passengers watched, some standing, others still seated, their faces a mix of gratitude and regret. Harold, the older man in the faded leather jacket, nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through. Told you, Ellen, he said, his voice low but triumphant. She's the one from Denver. Ellen, her knitting magazine forgotten. Nodded, her eyes fixed on Sarah with newfound respect. David, the man with the family photo, stood, his hands trembling as he held the picture of his daughters. I'm sorry, he said, his voice raw. I thought you didn't care. I was wrong. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes softening. It's okay, she said, her voice gentle, like a weight lifted. Get home to your girls. David nodded, his grip on the photo tightening, a tear rolling down his cheek. Margaret, the influencer, approached hesitantly, her cashmere scarf clutched in her hands. I shouldn't have said those things, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. Sarah's expression remained calm, but she tilted her head slightly, her voice steady. You couldn't have, she said, and turned away, her tote slung over her shoulder. Robert, the businessman, stayed in his seat, his head down, his Rolex hidden under his sleeve, as if it embarrassed him now. Jake, the young guy in the hoodie, stood, his face red. I'm sorry, okay? He said, his voice shaking. I was scared, and I was wrong about you. Sarah gave a small nod, her eyes flicking to him for a moment. Fear makes people say things, she said, her voice quiet but firm, and she moved toward the exit. As Sarah stepped onto the tarmac, a small crowd of reporters had already gathered, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping. One, a young woman with a notepad, recognized Sarah and shouted, Agent Bennett, you're the hero of Flight 247. Can you tell us what happened? Sarah paused, her tote still over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowd. Just did what needed doing, she said, her voice calm, and kept walking. The reporters surged forward, but the Special Forces commander waved them back, his team forming a barrier. Sarah's steps were steady, her posture unchanged, as if the cameras and the attention were just another storm to weather. Back in the cabin, the passengers began to disembark, their whispers quieter, now their faces softened with reflection. The woman in the red coat, her rosary still in hand, turned to her neighbor, the college student. I judged her, she said, her voice heavy with regret. I thought she was cold, but she saved us all. The student nodded, his backpack slung over his shoulder. We all did, he said, his voice low. We didn't see her. The passengers moved slowly, their earlier accusations hanging heavy, their fear replaced by a humbling realization. Lisa and Tommy were the last to leave, Tommy clutching the FBI badge, his eyes bright with pride. I'm gonna be brave like her, he whispered to his mother, who nodded, tears in her eyes. In the days that followed, the story of Flight 247 spread like wildfire. News reports hailed Sarah as a hero, her face splashed across screens, though she'd already slipped back into her quiet life. Her tote packed away, her navy sweater folded in a drawer. The passengers faced their own reckonings. Robert, the businessman, was quietly let go from his firm, a leaked email revealing his attempts to downplay his behavior on the flight, his reputation crumbling online. Margaret, the influencer, lost her sponsorships after passengers shared clips of her snide comments, her social media accounts going silent. Jake deleted his profiles, his friends distancing themselves after he tried to laugh off his accusations, the weight of his words sinking in. The woman in the red coat posted a public apology online, her voice trembling as she admitted her mistake. Her post gaining thousands of supportive comments, but costing her some close friendships. Sarah's story wasn't just about her courage. It was a mirror held up to those who'd judged her, a reminder that strength doesn't always shout. Years ago, in a quiet moment after her first mission, her FBI mentor had gripped her shoulder, his voice rough but warm. "You don't need to prove anything, Sarah," he'd said. "Just be ready." Now, as she walked away from the tarmac, that memory lingered in the way she adjusted her tote. Her steps, even her silence, saying everything. The crowd parted for her, their whispers fading their eyes, following the woman who'd changed everything without raising her voice. For those who'd been quick to judge Sarah's actions were a lesson etched in the chaos of that flight. Appearances deceive, and courage often wears a quiet face. Her calm wasn't arrogance, it was control honed through years of facing danger most would never understand. The passengers, once so ready to condemn her, carried that truth with them, a weight that reshaped their words, their actions, their hearts. To the listeners of this story, let it be a call to pause before judging, to look beyond the surface, to trust that strength can be silent, waiting in the wings. Ask yourself, when have you misjudged someone? When have you let fear cloud your view? Share your story, reflect on it, and carry this forward. Because true courage doesn't need a spotlight, and the quietest among us may be the ones who save the day.